On a rainy autumn morning, the ancient red brick buildings of Harvard stood tall under a gray sky. Students rushed through the gates holding books and coffee cups, chasing dreams that many believed only belonged to the smartest minds in the world. But in the corner of the campus, quietly pushing a janitor cart down a long hallway, was a man named Daniel. Daniel had worked at the university for more than 12 years. Every morning before sunrise, he cleaned lecture halls, wiped whiteboards, and picked up crumpled papers left behind by students who would one day become lawyers, scientists, and billionaires. But Daniel carried a secret dream, not for himself but for his daughter. Her name was Emily. She was 16, quiet, curious, and incredibly bright, but unlike the students walking through the famous gates, she didn't belong there officially. She wasn't enrolled, she didn't wear the Harvard hoodie or carry a student ID. She simply waited for her father to finish work while studying in empty classrooms. And that morning would become the day that changed everything. Welcome to Starts of Soul, where we share powerful stories that remind us that greatness can rise from the most unexpected places. If you believe in stories of courage, intelligence, and destiny, make sure you stay with us until the end. Emily sat in the back of a large lecture hall, her notebook open, her pencil moving quickly across the page. She loved numbers, the way they formed patterns, the way equations felt like puzzles waiting to be solved. Her father had allowed her to sit quietly in the back as long as she never disturbed the class. Today's lecture was Advanced Theoretical Mathematics, a class meant for graduate students. At the front of the room stood Professor Richard Hawthorne, one of the most respected mathematicians in the university, known for his brilliance but also his sharp tongue. Students admired him, but many feared him. He wrote an enormous equation across the board, a complicated mathematical proof that stretched from one side of the whiteboard to the other. He turned to the class. "This problem," he said, "has challenged mathematicians for years. I would be surprised if anyone here could solve it." The room fell silent. Students stared at the board, whispering to each other, unsure where to even begin. Emily's eyes sparkled. She recognized the structure of the equation almost instantly. Her pencil began moving faster. Meanwhile, Professor Hawthorne noticed something in the back of the room. A young girl wearing simple clothes, not a student. He frowned. "You there?" he said sharply. The entire class turned around. Emily froze. "Yes, you in the back," the professor said. "Who are you?" Her voice was soft. "I'm Emily, sir. I'm waiting for my father. He works here." A few students chuckled quietly. The professor raised an eyebrow. "This is a graduate-level mathematics lecture, not a waiting room." The laughter in the room grew louder. Emily felt her cheeks burn, but she remained silent. Hawthorne pointed toward the board. "Tell me," he said, "since you're here, do you understand what this equation represents?" More laughter. One student whispered, "This should be good." Emily hesitated. A part of her wanted to stay quiet, but another part of her, the part that loved numbers, knew the answer. "Yes," she said quietly. The room went silent. The professor crossed his arms, amused. "Oh, really? Then please enlighten us." Emily stood slowly. Her hands trembled slightly as she walked down the long aisle toward the board. Students whispered and smirked, expecting embarrassment. When she reached the front, the professor handed her the marker with a sarcastic smile. "Go ahead," he said, "show us." Emily stared at the equation. Then calmly she erased a small section. The class gasped. "What are you doing?" the professor said sharply. But Emily continued. She rewrote the step, correcting a small assumption that had been made in the middle of the equation. Then she added 3 more lines. The room became completely silent. Students leaned forward in their seats. Something was happening. Emily continued writing, moving step by step, explaining quietly. "The problem isn't impossible," she said. "The approach is just slightly wrong. Instead of applying direct integration here, you transform the expression using a substitution method." She wrote 2 more lines. The equation simplified. Then another step. Suddenly the enormous complicated problem collapsed into a clean, elegant solution. Emily stepped back and placed the marker down. There was complete silence. 30 graduate students stared at the board in shock. Professor Hawthorne walked slowly toward the equation, his eyes scanning every step. His expression changed. Confusion. Then disbelief. Then something else. Respect. He picked up the marker and checked the work carefully. Line by line. It was flawless. Not only had she solved the equation, she had solved it using a method that was faster and more elegant than the traditional approach. One student whispered, "That's impossible." Another said, "She just solved a problem we've been stuck on for weeks." Professor Hawthorne turned slowly toward Emily. His voice was no longer sarcastic. "How old are you?" 16, she replied softly. And where do you study? Emily looked down. I don't study here, sir. My father is a janitor. I just read books while waiting for him. The room went completely still. At that moment, the classroom door opened. Daniel stood there holding a mop bucket. He had heard the whispers in the hallway and rushed in, worried his daughter had gotten into trouble. Emily, he said nervously. I'm sorry, Professor, she won't disturb the class again. But Professor Hawthorne didn't respond immediately. He was still staring at the equation. Finally he spoke. Sir, he said slowly, how long has your daughter been learning mathematics? Daniel looked confused. Learning. She just reads books at the public library. Sometimes she borrows old textbooks students throw away. A quiet murmur spread across the room. The professor turned back to Emily. Do you understand what you just solved? She nodded slightly. It's a nonlinear transformation problem that simplifies through substitution. The professor exhaled slowly. In 30 years of teaching he had never seen anything like this. A girl with no formal education solving a problem that had challenged graduate students. The entire room stood frozen. Then something unexpected happened. One student began clapping. Then another. And another. Within seconds the entire lecture hall erupted into applause. Emily looked overwhelmed. Daniel stood near the door, stunned, unsure what was happening. Professor Hawthorne raised his hand and the room became quiet again. Miss Emily, he said calmly. I believe you belong at this university far more than many people already here. The words hung in the air. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. But the professor wasn't finished. He turned toward the class. Today you have all witnessed something extraordinary. Talent does not come from privilege. It comes from curiosity, discipline, and courage. Then he looked back at Emily. Would you be willing to return tomorrow and attend my class? Not as a visitor, but as my student. Emily blinked in disbelief. But sir, she whispered, I'm not enrolled here. Professor Hawthorne smiled for the first time that morning. Leave that part to me. The next morning something remarkable happened. Word had spread across campus. Students whispered about the janitor's daughter who solved the impossible equation. When Emily entered the lecture hall, dozens of students turned to look. But this time there was no laughter. Only respect. Professor Hawthorne introduced her simply. This is Emily. And today we will all learn something from her. Weeks passed. Emily continued attending the class. Faculty members began hearing about her abilities. Soon professors from different departments invited her to participate in advanced discussions. She solved complex problems faster than most graduate students. And something even more surprising began to happen. Students started asking her for help. The same students who had laughed before. One evening Daniel waited outside the classroom like he always did. Emily walked out holding a letter. Her hands trembled. What is it, sweetheart? Daniel asked. She handed him the envelope. It was from the university administration. Daniel opened it slowly. His eyes widened. The letter offered Emily a full academic scholarship, special admission, and mentorship from the mathematics department. Harvard had officially invited the janitor's daughter to become one of its youngest students. Daniel's hands shook. For years he had cleaned classrooms, dreaming his daughter might one day sit in one. Now she would study there. Not as a visitor, but as a scholar. Emily hugged her father tightly. None of this would have happened without you, she whispered. Daniel smiled through tears. No, he said. It happened because you never stopped believing you could learn. Months later, Professor Hawthorne stood in front of a crowded auditorium. He pointed to the board where a new complex equation waited. Then he turned toward Emily sitting in the front row. Miss Emily, he said with a small smile. Would you like to start us off? The audience chuckled warmly. Emily stood confidently, picked up the marker, and once again began writing. But this time, no one laughed. Because everyone in that room knew they were watching the future. And it all started the moment a professor mocked a janitor's daughter. Only to discover that genius had been quietly sitting in the back of his classroom all along. And sometimes the brightest minds are not the ones with the most prestigious titles. They are the ones who never stop learning even when the world underestimates them. Because brilliance can come from anywhere. Even from the daughter of the man cleaning the floors. And that day at Harvard every student learned a lesson far more important than mathematics. Never judge someone's intelligence by their position. Because the person you underestimate today might be the one who changes the world tomorrow.